The emergency corridor of Santa Aurelia Hospital smelled of disinfectant, burnt coffee, and contained fear. But that morning, everyone stopped moving when Alexander Whitmore appeared in a black coat soaked by the rain, holding an envelope and documents in his hand. Behind him came his lawyer, a colorless man who seemed to have no pulse, while two hospital guards tried to work out why the chief executive of Whitmore Health, owner of half of Madrid's private clinic network, had walked in without warning at 2:17 in the morning. Lucy Carter looked up from the nurse's station with a tray of gauze pressed against her chest, her face pale with exhaustion, and one hand resting instinctively on her rounded belly. Alexander had not come to ask whether she was all right, or to apologize, or to listen to an explanation he had refused to hear for 6 months. He had come to watch her sign the divorce papers. For a few seconds, the sounds of the hospital grew distant, as though the sirens of the ambulance that had just arrived from Gran Via had become trapped behind glass. Alexander looked first at Lucy's blue uniform, then at the deep shadows beneath her eyes, then at her sneakers stained with the blood of some patient who was not her, and finally at the belly he could not ignore, however badly he wanted to tear it from his sight. The lawyer coughed discreetly, believing he needed to act before the silence became a scandal, and held the pen out over the counter like a cleanly delivered sentence. Lucy did not take the pen. She did not cry either. She merely tightened her fingers around the tray, until the gauze compressed against her chest, while a resident, 2 orderlies, and an elderly woman, seated in a wheelchair, watched the scene with cruel, silent curiosity. "Sign!" Alexander said. His voice sounded lower than he expected, almost broken, although his face still belonged to a man accustomed to buying buildings, firing executives, and closing deals without asking permission. "I asked one thing of you in this life, Lucy, that you never lie to me. If you wanted to leave with another man, you should have had the courage to say so before turning my name into a joke." Lucy lowered her eyes to the white envelope, where her full name was written, Lucy Carter Whitmore. She felt that the last name linking her to him before the law weighed more heavily than all the sleepless nights since she had been thrown out of the family mansion. She did not answer, because she had learned that when a rich man decides a poor woman is guilty, every word she says becomes another piece of evidence against her. A murmur passed through the corridor when a young nurse, unable to restrain herself, looked at Lucy's belly, and then at Alexander's face. The lawyer did the same, but with calculated slowness, as though he had discovered an inconvenient detail in a multi-million-dollar contract. Alexander followed their gaze, and for the first time in months, the world shifted beneath his feet. Lucy was expecting a child, not a recent pregnancy, not a fragile uncertainty that could be easily explained, but an advanced, visible life, protected beneath the trembling hand of a woman who was working nights when she should have been resting. The timing struck him full force. 6 months. 6 months since the last night they had slept beneath the same roof, before a photograph convinced him that she had walked out of a hotel with another man. 6 months since he had called her a traitor and ordered her never to return. Lucy noticed the change in his eyes before Alexander could conceal it. For an instant, she saw the man she had loved, not the icy CEO standing before her, but the husband who had once promised that no one would ever make her feel lesser again, because she had been born without an important family name. That weakness frightened her more than his anger, because if Alexander suspected that the baby was his, the Whitmore family would come for the child with lawyers, doctors, judges, and poisonous smiles. So she lifted her chin, gathered what little pride she had left, and spoke with a calm that tore at her throat. "Do not start counting, Alexander. This baby does not belong to you." The murmur became a collective sigh, as though everyone had been granted permission to judge her. Alexander stepped back, wounded in a way he did not know how to name, and the lawyer closed the envelope with discreet satisfaction, believing that her statement made the divorce easier. But the lie Lucy had just told was not born of contempt. It was born of fear. Fear that Margaret Whitmore, Alexander's mother, would look at her again with those cold eyes that hid more pain than arrogance. Fear that Isabella Reynolds, the perfect former fiancé, would appear in her luxury heels to remind her that women like Lucy did not raise heirs in families like the Whitmores. Fear that the name that had once protected her would become a cage for her child. Alexander, however, heard only another betrayal. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripped the edge of the counter, and for a second he looked ready to break the marble with his hands. If this story has captured you from the beginning, stay until the end, because no photograph tells the whole truth, and no mother sells what is most sacred without a reason. The automatic emergency doors burst open and 2 paramedics entered, pushing a stretcher, forcing everyone aside. Lucy reacted before anyone else. She set down the tray, took the patient report, and walked toward triage with the weary discipline of someone who had learned to keep functioning even when her heart was in pieces. Alexander watched her bend over a feverish child, order fluids, request an IV, steady a desperate mother, and smile with tenderness, while her own hand returned to her belly, as though the baby were reminding her to breathe. The sight left him more defenseless than any scream could have. The woman he had imagined living with a lover in some luxury apartment was cleaning someone else's blood at 3 in the morning, her ankles swollen and her face, that of someone who had spent months surviving without asking for anything. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should continue this somewhere else," the lawyer whispered. Alexander did not answer. His attention had become trapped on an absurd detail. Lucy was no longer wearing her wedding ring. Throughout their marriage, even during their worst arguments, she had never taken it off. She said she did not wear it because of its price, although everyone knew it was an antique Whitmore family piece, but because it reminded her that someone had chosen her without asking for a resume, a bank account, or a family tree. Now her finger was bare, but it still bore a pale mark, a circular shadow on her skin, like a small, silent scar. Alexander felt a stab of anger at the thought that perhaps she had removed it to erase their marriage. He did not yet know that its absence from her hand was the first crack in the lie that had destroyed everything. 6 months earlier, Lucy still lived in the Whitmore mansion, a pale stone house in La Moraleja, where flowers were replaced before they wilted, and silences weighed more than the antique furniture. She had entered that world without knowing how to walk across marble, without understanding why the staff lowered their voices whenever Margaret entered, and without imagining that Alexander's love would not be enough to protect her from a family that measured a person's worth by their surnames. She came from Vallecas, from a small apartment with damp walls, double shifts, night buses, and a mother who had taught her never to be ashamed of working with her hands. Alexander met her one rainy afternoon, when Lucy helped Margaret in the middle of the street after the older woman became dizzy outside a pharmacy. She did not know who she was. She only saw an elegant woman trying not to fall. That first time, Alexander arrived at the private hospital furious because no security officer had accompanied his mother, and he found Lucy seated beside Margaret, holding her hand while arguing with reception because they wanted to wait for administrative authorization before performing an urgent test. "If she were your mother, you would not ask for stamps. You would ask for a doctor," Lucy had said, with a courage that made Margaret look at her in surprise, and Alexander with something close to admiration. Then came the thanks, an uncomfortable dinner, an unexpected phone call, a bouquet Lucy rejected because she did not accept gifts from rich strangers, and a love that grew too quickly for the Whitmore family to stop it. Alexander, accustomed to everyone wanting something from him, fell in love precisely because Lucy seemed to be the only person who wanted nothing but the truth. That was why, when he believed she had betrayed him, the blow was even more brutal. Isabella Reynolds never accepted the marriage. She had been raised to become Mrs. Whitmore, to smile at charity galas, appear on discreet magazine covers, and merge her family fortune with Alexander's healthcare empire. To the world she was elegant, charitable, and serene. In private, she looked at Lucy the way one looks at a stain on an expensive dress. "Do not try so hard," she told her one night during a family dinner, while everyone pretended not to hear. "An accent can be corrected, and clothes can be bought, but origins always find a way to reveal themselves." Lucy swallowed, and Alexander, who had heard the remark, took her hand beneath the table. That gesture would have been enough to make her happy if she had not noticed Margaret watching them with an unreadable expression, as though she knew that love inside a house full of interests was a candle burning in a drafty room. The final crack began with Margaret's illness. Doctors discovered a heart complication, requiring urgent intervention, but the news had to remain secret because Whitmore Health was in the middle of an international negotiation, and any rumor about the health of the family matriarch could sink shares, alliances, and votes on the board. Alexander was in Barcelona closing a deal when Margaret worsened in the middle of the night. The direct office line went unanswered. His secretary screened calls, and when Lucy saw Margaret doubled over in pain in the library, she did not think about protocols or inheritances. She called a private ambulance, accompanied her mother-in-law, and signed as the temporary responsible party so she could be treated. The problem came when the clinic demanded an immediate advance payment for imported medication that could not be charged to accounts frozen by the internal audit. Lucy did not have that amount of money, but she did have something everyone in the mansion considered untouchable. That same morning, red-eyed and wearing wrinkled clothes, Lucy entered a pawn shop in Lavapier's and placed on the counter the wedding ring Alexander had slipped onto her finger, amid applause and cameras. The owner, an older man named George, recognized the piece and asked whether she was certain. Lucy held his gaze for only a few seconds before breaking inside. "I am not selling it because I want to forget him," she said. "I am selling it because someone has to live." She left with a folded receipt in her pocket and the sensation that she had torn away a piece of her own skin. She paid for the medication, ensured Margaret underwent surgery in time, and asked everyone not to tell Alexander until he returned. She did not want her husband carrying guilt in the middle of the negotiation. Nor did she imagine that while she was saving his mother, someone else was preparing the photograph that would condemn her. Daniel Whitmore, Alexander's cousin, and the eternal second man in the shadows, had spent years waiting for an opportunity to weaken him. He knew Isabella wanted her place back. He knew Lucy was the CEO's vulnerable point, and he knew that a carefully planted accusation of infidelity could destroy more than a financial scandal. Dr. Matthew Sullivan, Margaret's cardiologist, had asked Lucy to meet him at a discreet hotel because a foreign specialist staying there needed to review a report without attracting suspicion. Lucy went in exhausted haste, wearing the same gray coat as always, unaware that a camera was waiting across the street. Matthew came out behind her, barely 5 minutes later, holding a medical folder, but the final photograph was cropped, darkened, and sent to Alexander with a poisonous line. "Your wife does not visit hospitals when she says she is working. She visits hotel rooms." The message arrived just before his return to Madrid. Alexander did not ask for an explanation. That was the wound he would later be unable to forgive in himself. He arrived at the mansion with the printed photograph in his hand and found Lucy in the bedroom, placing Margaret's prescriptions inside a folder. He mistook her nervousness for guilt. She tried to speak about the emergency, the operation, and Dr. Sullivan, but Alexander threw the photograph onto the bed as though hurling a sentence. "Do not use my mother's name to cover your shame," he said with a coldness that left her breathless. Lucy looked at the image and understood too late that someone had turned her sacrifice into betrayal. She wanted to show him the hospital receipt, but it was in the bag she had left in Margaret's room. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, but Alexander had already called the driver to remove her suitcases. That night, it rained just as it did now. They threw her out without raising their voices, and that was worse. The staff lowered their eyes as Lucy crossed the entrance hall with 2 small suitcases. No jewelry, no adequate coat, and no opportunity to say goodbye to Margaret, who remained sedated after the procedure. Isabella appeared beside the staircase holding a glass of water and wearing the smile of someone who had already rehearsed her victory. "At least have the decency to disappear quickly," she murmured. "Stories about poor girls do not last long once they stop being entertaining." Lucy did not answer. Outside, Alexander stood rigid with his back to her beside the window, as though watching her leave might turn him into a weak man. She waited for one absurd second, hoping he would turn, say her name, or hesitate. He did not, and when the door closed behind her, Lucy pressed a hand to her chest, unaware that a life had just begun inside her body. 2 weeks later, in the narrow bathroom of a boarding house near Atocha, Lucy held a positive pregnancy test while a neighbor pounded on the wall and told her to stop crying. Her first thought was of Alexander, her second of the photograph, and her third of the Whitmore family lawyers. If she went back and told the truth, who would believe her? A woman accused of adultery always arrives too late to defend herself. Margaret was still cut off from visitors by medical order. Isabella controlled access, and Daniel had begun leaking rumors about an inevitable separation. Lucy looked for work in hospitals that would not ask too many questions, and accepted night shifts because there were fewer familiar eyes after dark. Every wave of nausea, every dizzy spell, and every kick from the baby became part of a silent promise. Her child would not grow up begging for love from people who only understood blood when it came, accompanied by power. On the morning Alexander came to the hospital, Lucy had been on her feet for 14 hours. She had changed sheets, translated the fear of an elderly woman who did not understand her test results, calmed a drunken man, held the hand of a teenager who had lost her baby, and twice hidden her own cramps in the supply room. No one at Whitmore Health knew she worked there because the hospital, although indirectly owned by the group, was managed by a subsidiary using temporary contracts. To the system, Lucy was simply another employee. To Alexander's world, she was a convenient disgrace that had to remain far away. That was why, when she saw him enter with the divorce envelope, she felt no surprise, only exhaustion. She had imagined that moment many times, but she had never thought he would arrive on the very night her body could no longer pretend to be strong. "Mrs. Carter, you need to rest," Dr. Caroline Bennett warned as she passed after the incident with Alexander. Caroline was a 60-year-old woman with a dry voice and kind hands, the only person who knew almost the entire truth without forcing Lucy to tell it all. Lucy shook her head and continued entering information on a screen she could barely see. From the far end of the corridor, Alexander heard the word rest and felt an irritating guilt, an emotion he tried to turn into anger so he would not collapse. The lawyer insisted that she sign as soon as possible, but Alexander had stopped listening. Dates appeared in his mind, nights and unanswered calls. The condition of his mother, the missing ring, Lucy's belly. Something did not fit. And when Alexander Whitmore detected a crack in a story, he did not rest until he had opened it completely, even if what he found behind it was his own ruin. Lucy returned to the counter holding a medical folder, determined to finish her shift and pretend Alexander's presence had not reopened an old wound. He brought the envelope closer again, but this time he did not push it toward her with the same arrogance. "How many months pregnant are you?" he asked. The question sounded gentle, almost dangerous. Lucy felt the baby move as though recognizing the voice it had never heard up close. "Far enough along to know I do not need your permission to keep living," she answered, and this time several nurses lowered their eyes in respect. Alexander swallowed. He wanted to say he had a right to know, but the word right tasted bitter. What right did the man who had thrown her out into the rain possess? What right did the man who had trusted a photograph over his wife's eyes have? Even so, pride still kept him from kneeling before doubt. Then something small happened, almost invisible, but enough to change the night. An orderly dropped a tray of patient files, and several pages slid across the floor to Alexander's shoes. He bent automatically and picked up one sheet before Lucy could stop him. He did not read the complete diagnosis, only a line, the date of a prenatal appointment, and a warning written by Caroline. Risk from exhaustion, history of severe stress, avoid extended shifts. The date cut through him. The first appointment had taken place only days after Lucy was expelled from the mansion. Alexander looked up and found Lucy watching him with terror, not guilt. That tiny, brutal distinction tightened around his chest. She snatched the page from his hands and whispered, "Do not turn my child into a war too." It was the first time Alexander understood that perhaps he was not the judge of the story, but one of the people responsible for it. Uncomfortable with the change in tension, the lawyer tried to regain control by reminding them that the divorce could be signed by mutual agreement that very week. Lucy finally took the pen, and Alexander felt an absurd panic when he saw its tip move toward the paper. He had come there to close a door, but suddenly he could not bear to hear the sound of that door shutting. "Do not sign," he said, too quickly and too quietly. Lucy froze. The entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me?" she asked, and for the first time in months, her voice revealed a crack. Alexander looked at the document, at her belly, at the ringless finger, and understood that asking for an explanation after condemning her was another form of violence. But he also understood that if he left without searching for the truth, he would lose more than a wife. He would lose his final chance not to become the monster his own house had created. Lucy placed the pen on the counter as though it burned and walked toward the break room, not to hide, but to breathe, before the pain in her belly bent her over again. Alexander tried to follow, but Dr. Caroline Bennett stepped between them, with the authority of someone who had seen too many lives begin and end, to fear a family name. "You have done enough damage for one night, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "If you truly want to know something, begin by asking yourself why a pregnant woman accepts overnight shifts in a hospital that belongs to her own husband." Alexander stood rooted to the floor. Her husband. Spoken by a stranger, the words sounded like an accusation stronger than any insult. Outside, rain struck the hospital windows, and for the first time since the photograph, Alexander did not think about Lucy's betrayal. He thought about how readily he had wanted to believe she was guilty. Before leaving, Alexander picked up the divorce envelope and placed it inside his coat, instead of handing it to the lawyer. Then he walked toward the exit, but stopped in front of the staff board displaying the week's shifts. Lucy's name appeared on too many consecutive nights for a woman in her condition. Beside the board stood a lost and found box, and inside it, by chance or destiny, glinted a cheap hospital wristband bearing the printed name Margaret Whitmore and a date from 6 months earlier. Alexander drew a breath, took out his phone, and called his personal assistant with an order he had never imagined giving. "I want every payment made during my mother's private hospitalization, including those that did not pass through our accounts, and search every jeweler, pawn shop, or other place where a Whitmore ring may have appeared during the last 6 months. Silence answered from the other end of the line. Then the investigation began. Alexander Whitmore did not return to the mansion that morning, although the driver waited outside the hospital entrance with the engine running and the heat on. He remained in the back seat, with the divorce envelope resting on his knees, watching the rain turn the emergency lights into red and blue stains across the glass. For 6 months, he had repeated a convenient version of the story. Lucy had deceived him. He had acted with dignity. Divorce was the inevitable consequence. But the image of her belly, her swollen hands, and the pure fear on her face when he read the date of the prenatal appointment began to break that version apart, like a patient leak soaking through a false wall. Alexander's assistant answered the call in a sleepy voice, but woke fully when he heard his employer's tone. Whitmore did not ask for favors at that hour. He gave orders that usually changed contracts, careers, or destinies. "I want the records from my mother's hospitalization. All of them, including outside payments, manual authorizations, emergency calls, and the names of every doctor present that night," Alexander said, looking at the door through which Lucy had disappeared minutes earlier. "I also want to know who had access to the hotel security records from the place where that photograph was supposedly taken. Do not bring me rumors. Bring me documents." When he ended the call, the silence inside the car was heavier than the rain, because for the first time, the word supposedly had entered his own mouth. 6 months earlier, that word would have been impossible. Alexander had trusted the photograph with shameful speed, not because the evidence was perfect, but because it touched a wound he had never confessed. The fear that Lucy would grow tired of living in a world that despised her. The Whitmore family had turned every dinner into a silent examination, every social event into a trap of etiquette, and every gesture Lucy made into proof that she did not belong there. She smiled, learned, kept quiet, and at night removed her shoes beside the bed as though she were also taking off the humiliations. Alexander saw it and promised to protect her, but he almost always arrived too late, occupied with meetings where the future of a company demanding more loyalty than any marriage was decided. Lucy had learned as a child that shame was a luxury the poor could not afford. Her mother cleaned offices at dawn, and her father disappeared before she was old enough to remember his voice. So she grew up measuring money in bags of groceries, overdue bills, and shoes that had to last more than one winter. The first time she entered the Whitmore house, she wore a simple dress borrowed from a co-worker and carried a dignity no one knew how to classify. Margaret looked her up and down without insulting her, but she did not embrace her either. Daniel smiled too much. Isabella, the supposedly casual guest at a dinner that was not casual at all, raised her glass. "Alexander has always had noble impulses," Isabella said that night, stirring her wine without drinking it. "But impulses do not hold a family together." Lucy understood the blow, even wrapped in silk. Alexander clenched his jaw, and replied that he was not marrying for convenience, but for love. Everyone smiled the way adults smile at a child who says a beautiful word in a language they have already forgotten. Margaret did not defend Lucy, but neither did she support Isabella. She remained silent with one hand near her chest, as if a hidden pain reminded her that appearances save no one when the body begins to fail. Lucy noticed the gesture and was the only person who later asked whether she was feeling well. That tiny, almost invisible act marked the beginning of a strange relationship between Lucy and Margaret. Alexander's mother was never warm with her. She never called her daughter, not once. She presented her proudly to friends from the foundation, yet accepted her herbal teas when no one was looking, and allowed her to sit beside her in the library during afternoons of migraines. Lucy discovered that Margaret was not merely an arrogant woman. She was a woman raised never to need anyone. Even as she was breaking apart inside, Alexander did not understand how serious those episodes were, because his mother concealed them from him. Daniel minimized them, and the private doctors spoke in codes that protected the group's image more than the patient's life. On the night her condition worsened, Lucy found Margaret bent over the desk, her lips colorless, and her fingers gripping a financial report. The older woman tried to order her not to call anyone, but no voice came out. Lucy did not think about hierarchy. She called emergency services, requested a private ambulance, and searched for Alexander's number while holding her mother-in-law against her chest. He was in Barcelona at a closing dinner with German investors, and his phone had been left with a secretary who screened the call as non-urgent. Lucy left 3 messages. None reached him in time. When the ambulance left the mansion, Daniel appeared in the entrance hall with unnaturally perfect calm and asked where they were taking his aunt. "To a hospital where they should have taken her weeks ago," Lucy answered without hiding her anger. Daniel looked at her as though an employee had raised her voice at him. "Be careful, Lucy. In this family, doing the right thing without permission can look very much like causing trouble." She did not understand then that the sentence was a threat. At the clinic, Dr. Matthew Sullivan confirmed that Margaret needed immediate medication before the procedure. Imported medication that could not wait for the finance department to release funds. The family's primary account was frozen by an internal audit Daniel had requested, supposedly to protect the group. The insurer demanded verification. Margaret was unconscious. Lucy looked at the ring on her hand and knew what she had to do. The ring was not merely jewelry. Alexander had given it to her in a discreet ceremony away from the press, because Lucy did not want their wedding turned into a spectacle. It was an antique piece with a small diamond surrounded by family engravings, less ostentatious than the other treasures in the house, but infinitely more meaningful. "I do not want you to wear it as a mark of ownership," Alexander had told her as he placed it on her finger. "I want you to wear it as a promise that even inside my world, you will have a place chosen by you." Lucy believed that promise. That was why, when she removed it at the pawnshop counter, she did not feel as though she were selling gold. She felt as though she were mortgaging the only proof that someone had once chosen her, without being ashamed of her. Payment was made in cash with a simple receipt and an incomplete name, because Lucy did not want Margaret's operation used as a political weapon inside the group. Matthew promised medical discretion and later accompanied her to collect a report that had to be reviewed by a specialist staying at a nearby hotel. Everything felt urgent, uncomfortable, but necessary. Lucy did not see the man with the camera across the street, nor did she see Daniel seated inside a dark car, speaking on the phone with Isabella. "She is inside," he said, while watching the hotel's revolving door. "The doctor will come out behind her. With the right angle, Alexander will not ask any questions." Isabella remained silent for a few seconds and then answered with cheerful coldness. "Then he will finally remember that a suitable wife would never have caused this disaster." The photograph was sent to Alexander before Lucy could return to the clinic. The image showed Matthew leaning toward her at the hotel entrance, at the exact moment he handed her a folder. The crop removed the medical courier, the hospital seal, and the true distance between them. The nighttime lighting added intimacy where there had been only haste. When Alexander opened the message, the dinner in Barcelona was still full of toasts and smiles, but something went dark inside him with silent violence. He remembered Isabella's remarks, Lucy's absences over the previous nights, her exhaustion, and her evasiveness about Margaret. He did not consider that perhaps his wife was protecting a life. He believed he had been humiliated, and pride, when mixed with pain, usually chooses the lie that best justifies its anger. Lucy returned to the mansion at dawn with freezing hands and the medication receipt inside her bag. She wanted to shower, call Alexander again, and return to the hospital before Margaret woke. She found the lights on, Isabella in the sitting room, and Daniel beside the fireplace, as though the house had been waiting for a trial. Alexander emerged from the study holding the printed photograph. At first, he did not shout. That was the worst part. His silence had the precision of a scalpel. "Explain why my wife is leaving a hotel with Matthew Sullivan while my mother is hospitalized," he said. Lucy tried to approach him, but Isabella placed an enlarged copy of the picture on the table. "Poor Alexander," she whispered. "Some noble hearts mistake gratitude for love." "That is not what it looks like," Lucy said, feeling for the first time the true danger of such a weak sentence. Alexander gave a joyless laugh. "Of course it never is." She tried to speak about Margaret, the medication, and the operation, but Daniel intervened in a gentle voice, insisting the doctors had handled everything internally and that no one needed Lucy to play the savior. Isabella added that an innocent woman did not meet married men at hotels in the middle of the night. Matthew was not even married, but the lie no longer required precision. Alexander searched Lucy's hand for the ring and did not find it. That detail, which should have forced him to ask questions, completed her condemnation in his mind. He believed she had taken it off to meet another man. Lucy tried to pull the receipt from her bag, but a staff member entered crying to report that Margaret had awakened, disoriented, and that the clinic needed a direct relative. Alexander left without looking at Lucy. Daniel blocked her path with poisonous courtesy. "Do not make this more complicated. If you truly love him, disappear before this reaches the press." Lucy ran after Alexander into the entrance hall, but he turned with his eyes full of a wound that would not allow him to see her as his wife, only as his enemy. "Get out of my house," he said, "and do not use my mother to clean up what you did." The words emptied her. Rain struck the front door. Isabella smiled from the staircase, and Lucy understood that no one in that house wanted the truth. The first nights after she was expelled became a succession of borrowed rooms, unanswered calls, and emotional fever. Lucy did not have enough money because she had spent almost everything on Margaret, and she could not return to her sick, proud mother without explaining that the marriage which had looked like a fairy tale had become a sentence. She searched for the medication receipt, but the bag containing several papers had remained at the mansion in the chaos. She called Matthew, who promised to speak with Alexander, but the next day the doctor received a legal warning against revealing Margaret's private information. Daniel was closing doors with professional speed. Isabella, meanwhile, began appearing beside Alexander in magazines beneath elegant headlines about family support in difficult times. When Lucy discovered the pregnancy, she did not immediately feel blessed. She felt terrified. The boarding house bathroom had a flickering bulb and a stained mirror in which she barely recognized her own face. She held the positive test as though it were a letter written by someone who did not yet know the danger of being born. She wanted to call Alexander and dialed his number 3 times. Not once did she press the call button. What could she say? That the child was his when he believed her capable of sleeping with someone else? That he should protect her when he had been the one to leave her in the rain? In the end, she pressed her forehead against the cold wall and promised quietly that the baby would not be used as a currency for forgiveness or as a weapon by a family that devoured its weakest members. Finding work was more difficult than she expected. Prestigious clinics closed their doors as soon as they saw her married name or heard rumors leaked by someone in the Whitmore circle. One supervisor told her with false sympathy that she did not want trouble with important sponsors. Another asked whether it was true that Lucy had tried to extort her husband. Lucy learned to introduce herself only as Carter, conceal the missing wedding band, and accept shifts no one else wanted. Santa Aurelia Hospital hired her temporarily for nights and weekends because hands were always scarce when the wealthy city slept and the real city bled. There, among lonely older patients, late-night accidents, and mothers crying without makeup, Lucy felt useful again, although every step reminded her that her body no longer belonged only to her. Dr. Caroline Bennett was the first to notice. One night, she found Lucy sitting pale in the supply room, one hand on her belly, and the other struggling to open a bottle of water. She did not ask who the baby's father was. She simply gave her a chair, a cookie, and a look without judgment. Over time, Caroline heard fragments: a mansion, a photograph, a husband who refused to listen, a sick mother-in-law, a ring sold. She never learned the complete story, but she understood what mattered. "Silence protects us sometimes," she told her one day, "but it also makes us sick." Lucy smiled sadly. Speaking does no good when the other person has already chosen which truth suits them. Caroline did not press her, although from then on, she began watching Lucy's shifts, her cramps, and the sadness she hid behind flawless efficiency. While Lucy survived, Isabella rebuilt the setting she had always wanted. She visited Margaret with outrageously expensive flowers, appeared beside Alexander at charity events, and spoke of family stability with calculated delicacy. Margaret, still weak, barely spoke. She had lost pieces of memory surrounding the night of the procedure, or so Daniel told every doctor who tried to question her. Alexander took refuge in work, convinced that exhaustion was an elegant way not to feel. Whenever someone mentioned Lucy, his face closed. Isabella used those silences to plant tiny phrases, that some women became dizzy in the presence of luxury, that gratitude was easily confused with ambition, that a clean divorce would prevent greater scandal. She never pushed too hard. She merely left poison where he could breathe it. Daniel's motives were darker than Isabella's. Alexander's separation did more than satisfy someone else's romantic obsession. It weakened the CEO before the board. A betrayed leader appeared vulnerable, impulsive, and easy to isolate. Margaret's illness also allowed Daniel to control documents, authorizations, and financial movements no one would review until it was too late. If Alexander married Isabella, the Reynolds alliance could temporarily stabilize the group, but it would also open a door for Daniel to negotiate internal shares in exchange for silence and stability. Lucy had become an unexpected obstacle because she did not obey the family's codes. She had saved Margaret without permission. She had seen frozen accounts. She had heard names she was not supposed to hear. That was why expelling her was not enough. They had to turn her into a woman without credibility. The night after seeing Lucy pregnant at the hospital, Alexander received the first partial report from his assistant. It did not say much, but it said enough to keep him awake. Margaret's hospitalization file contained a medical authorization issued before he arrived from Barcelona, signed by Lucy Carter as the responsible companion. There was also a note about an initial payment unrelated to Whitmore accounts, registered in cash by an unidentified person. The system did not show where the money came from. Alexander read the same line 3 times, feeling something cold climb his spine. If Lucy had been with a lover that night, why was she listed as the person who authorized his mother's treatment? If her goal had been to humiliate him, why had she used her own name to save Margaret? He called the clinic, asked for the administrator on duty, and received evasive answers. He called Matthew Sullivan, but the doctor did not answer. He called the mansion to ask about Margaret, and Daniel answered before any employee could, far too awake for the timing to be accidental. "Alexander, it is almost 4 in the morning. Has something happened?" he asked with polished calm. Alexander stared at the report on the screen. "That is what I am trying to find out." A tiny silence followed, barely a shadow between 2 breaths. "Be careful what you disturb," Daniel said. "Some wounds begin bleeding again if you insist on touching them." Alexander ended the call without saying goodbye. For the first time, the warning disguised as family concern sounded like fear. At the hospital, Lucy finished her shift at dawn and left through the employee entrance with a thin jacket over her shoulders. She did not know that a black car remained parked across the street. Alexander watched her walk slowly toward the bus stop, refusing the taxi a coworker tried to order. He saw her pause, rest one hand against a lamppost, and breathe deeply until the pain passed. No lover appeared. No luxury apartment waited for her. There was only an almost empty bus, a cloth bag containing a dirty uniform, and a pregnant woman counting coins before climbing aboard. Alexander felt shame so physically that he had to close his eyes. For 6 months, he had imagined her living a comfortable lie. The truth was far more unbearable. Perhaps the comfortable lie had been his. That morning, as the sun began to rise over Madrid, Alexander finally entered his private office at Whitmore Health and ordered that no one disturb him. He placed 3 things on the desk: the unsigned divorce envelope, the partial report from Margaret's hospitalization, and the copy of the photograph that had destroyed his marriage. For the first time, he studied it carefully, not as a wounded husband, but as a businessman accustomed to detecting manipulation. Matthew's shadow did not match the light from the hotel sign. Lucy's hand was not touching the doctor. The folder he had ignored bore a barely visible seal, a blue mark that might belong to a clinic. Alexander braced both hands on the desk and murmured a sentence no one heard. "Lucy, what the hell did they do to you?" And at that moment, although he did not yet know it, the search for the truth had begun. Alexander did not sleep that morning. He closed the office blinds, turned off the main phone, and allowed the silence to punish him as he returned again and again to the same documents. The photograph, Margaret's hospitalization record, Lucy's name as the responsible companion, and that absurd line about a cash payment looked like pieces of a puzzle someone had thrown onto the floor, intending for him to step on the most important ones. For months, he had used his pain as an excuse not to look closely. Now every detail that had once seemed like a conviction began to behave like a question. Why would Lucy have signed a medical authorization if she had been busy betraying him? Why had Margaret received treatment before he arrived? Why did Daniel always learn first whenever anyone tried to examine the past? At 9 in the morning, his assistant entered with dark circles under his eyes and a thick folder beneath his arm. His name was Samuel Brooks, and he had spent 8 years solving impossible problems for Alexander. But this time, he did not have his usual efficient manner. He looked uncomfortable, almost ashamed of what he had found. "I requested internal copies, but some records are blocked under a family authorization," he explained, placing the folder on the desk. "You did not sign the blocking order." Alexander did not ask who had. He knew before hearing the name. "Daniel," Samuel said, confirming it with a nod. Inside the folder were nursing schedules, emergency calls, partial receipts, and an administrative note stating that a young woman had delivered cash to release urgent medication. There was no full name, only the initials LC, and a nervous signature Alexander recognized, however much he wished he did not. The office began to feel too small. Alexander stood, walked to the window, and looked down over Madrid from the height of Whitmore Tower, a city he had always believed he controlled because he could buy its buildings and negotiate with its most influential men. But somewhere in that city, Lucy had sold something of her own to save his mother, and had then been expelled like a thief. Samuel continued cautiously. "I also reviewed the hotel entries. The system confirms that Dr. Matthew Sullivan was there for a private medical meeting with a German specialist staying in Suite 407. Lucy entered 22 minutes before he did and left carrying a sealed folder. In the photograph you received, that folder was almost completely cropped out." Alexander closed his eyes. What he felt was not relief. It was shame so deep it burned his throat. "Find the pawn shop," he ordered without turning. If the payment was made in cash and the ring disappeared that morning, she must have sold it somewhere near the clinic or along the route back. Samuel hesitated. "Sir, if we do this officially, Daniel will find out." Alexander turned slowly, and for the first time in a long while his face did not show anger, but something more dangerous: determination. "Then do not do it officially. Treat it as though you were trying to locate stolen jewelry before filing a report. And Samuel, no one in my family is to know that I am searching for Lucy's ring." The assistant nodded. Both men understood that the object was no longer a symbol of marriage. It was silent evidence of a truth that might have been shining before them in the wrong hand while they preferred to stare at a manipulated photograph. That same afternoon, Alexander returned to Santa Aurelia Hospital, but he did not enter through the main doors or ask to see Lucy. He stayed in an administrative room, reviewing personnel records under the pretense of an internal audit. The lie tasted miserable, but he needed to see how she had lived without turning his presence into yet another pressure. The records showed back-to-back night shifts, rejected leave, last-minute substitutions, and brief medical notes signed by Dr. Caroline Bennett. Risk of exhaustion, edema in the legs, episode of dizziness, Reduced hours recommended. Beside each one was always Lucy's response. Fit to continue. Alexander did not know whether to admire her or hate himself more for having forced her, directly or indirectly, into such resistance. He imagined his child, because he could no longer stop thinking of the baby that way, growing inside a woman who had to ask permission even to sit down. Caroline Bennett found him in the records room, as though she had known from the beginning that he would end up there. She entered without knocking, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had no intention of bowing to any surname. "If you came looking for evidence against her, you have wasted your time," she said. Alexander closed the folder and met her gaze. "I came to learn what happened." Caroline gave a dry laugh. That is what men usually say when the truth has bitten their pride. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the doctor approached and placed an incident report on the table. It stated that Lucy had fainted in the supply room 3 weeks earlier after completing a double shift. She refused to go home because she needed to pay the rent and buy prenatal vitamins her temporary insurance did not cover. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, does your world call that ambition too?" Alexander lifted the page carefully, as though he might hurt her by touching it. "Did she tell you anything about me?" Caroline studied him with a mixture of hardness and compassion. Very little. Enough to know that she loved a man who preferred an image over years of affection. "She also told me she sold something important to save a woman who later could not defend her. She did not say the woman was your mother, but I am not stupid." Alexander felt the walls tilt. He wanted to ask whether Lucy had said the baby was his, but the question felt indecent. Caroline seemed to read it. "Do not expect me to hand you secrets she guards out of fear. If you want answers, begin by proving you will not use them to take away the only thing keeping her on her feet." Before leaving, Alexander saw Lucy through the glass of an observation room. She was helping an elderly woman drink water, smiling with quiet tenderness that contrasted with the pallor of her face. The gesture struck him harder than any accusation Caroline had made. Lucy had not hardened her heart, even though life had cornered her. She continued caring for strangers with the same devotion she had shown Margaret. When she turned, their eyes met for an instant. Lucy stopped smiling. There was no visible reproach, no plea, and no explanation. There was only a distance so vast that Alexander understood the truth, even if it emerged, would not automatically erase the damage. She looked away first and continued working. He remained motionless, aware that perhaps he had lost the right to hear her voice without making it tremble. Samuel called at dusk. He had found a lead in Lavapiés, a small pawn shop whose owner remembered an antique piece with the Whitmore crest engraved inside. Alexander drove himself, without a chauffeur, through narrow streets he rarely visited. Streets that showed him a Madrid, different from the one made up of his guarded restaurants and private garages. The shop stood between a closed fruit market and an internet cafe lit in blue. In the window were used watches, gold chains, old cameras, and small human failures labeled with modest prices. Alexander stood outside the door for several seconds, unable to enter. Lucy had brought her marriage promise there and turned it into medicine. He had brought his pride to a mansion and turned it into punishment. The comparison was unbearable. The owner was named George, an older man with white hair and hands stained by years of touching other people's metals. At first he distrusted Alexander, perhaps because of his expensive suit, perhaps because of his surname, but when Alexander described the ring, George opened a small safe and removed a registration card. "I do not have it here anymore," he said. "I kept it because the girl asked for time to buy it back, but someone came weeks later with family ownership documents and took it after paying more than twice the amount." Alexander tensed. "Who?" George adjusted his glasses. "An elegant blonde woman accompanied by a younger man. They gave very few details. She said the ring belonged to an important family and that the seller had obtained it under questionable circumstances." Alexander saw Isabella's face before the man finished speaking. George searched through the papers until he found the original receipt. Lucy's trembling signature appeared before Alexander like an open wound. The date matched the morning of Margaret's hospitalization. The amount matched almost exactly the advance required for the urgent medication. In the handwritten notes was a sentence George had added as a matter of routine. "Customer requests repurchase option, cries. When surrendering the piece, states that it is her wedding ring." Alexander placed one hand on the counter to keep his balance. Did she say anything else? George asked. He looked at him sternly, as though beginning to understand who the man before him was. She said she was not selling it because she wanted to forget him. She said someone had to live. Then she walked away in the rain without an umbrella, as though she had already lost too much to care about getting wet. Alexander purchased a certified copy of the receipt and requested the security footage from that morning. George agreed after making him sign an improvised legal request Samuel had prepared while waiting outside in the car. In the video, Lucy appeared with a hollow face, her hair tied back carelessly, and the gray coat buttoned to her neck. She removed the ring slowly, held it to her lips for several seconds, and then handed it to the owner, as though surrendering an organ. Alexander could not watch the rest without feeling sick. He thought of the night he had asked about the ring, with contempt in his eyes. He thought about how easily he had turned the absence of a piece of jewelry into proof of infidelity. No one had forced him to be cruel. Others had prepared the trap, yes, but he had walked into it on his own feet. His next stop was Matthew Sullivan's office. The doctor agreed to see him after receiving 3 messages and a warning that Alexander would come anyway. Matthew was a serious man, with a short beard and weary eyes. Nothing like the seductive lover Alexander had imagined to feed his anger. He received him in a private consultation room, closed the door, and said before sitting, "If you came to threaten me, get in line. Your family did that 6 months ago." Alexander did not respond to the attack. He took out the photograph and placed it on the desk. "I need you to tell me what happened that night." Matthew looked at the image with old contempt. "What happened is that your wife saved your mother while you trusted cowards. What happened is that I tried to speak and received a legal order signed by Daniel Whitmore. What happened is that Lucy asked me not to insist because she feared damaging Margaret's recovery." Matthew opened a file on his computer and showed emails, medical appointments, hotel entry records, and a partial copy of the report Lucy had collected that morning. He explained that a German specialist, Dr. Weber, was staying there for a conference and had agreed to review Margaret's case urgently, outside official protocol to prevent leaks. Lucy arrived first because she carried the documents. Matthew arrived later because he had to validate the medication. The photograph had been taken when he handed her an additional folder at the entrance. There was no shared room, no dinner, and no romantic secret. The only intimacy that night was the desperation of a woman trying to keep an elderly lady from dying, Matthew said. Alexander listened to every word as though receiving blows he deserved. "Why did she not tell me afterward?" Matthew looked at him hard. "Because you did not ask." "You passed sentence." The words remained suspended between them. Alexander wanted to defend himself, mention his pain, the apparent deception, and the pressure from his family. But every excuse sounded small before it even left his mouth. Matthew handed him a drive containing backup copies. "I do not have the full original hotel video, but I know who might. The head of security that night was fired 2 days later without explanation. His name is Stephen Miller. He lives in Getafe. If Daniel got rid of him that quickly, perhaps it was because he saw something he was not supposed to see." Alexander put away the drive. Before he left, Matthew added in a lower voice, "Lucy did not want Alexander Whitmore to apologize out of pity. She wanted her husband to trust her when there was still no evidence. You lost that opportunity. What you do now will decide whether you also lose the right to know your child." While Alexander pursued the truth, Isabella began to feel the ground shifting beneath her heels. Daniel summoned her to a private room in a restaurant in Salamanca, away from the usual tables where society columnists might see them. She arrived immaculate, but her smile vanished when Daniel told her Alexander had requested old records. "I told you the pregnancy would complicate everything," he said, tapping one finger against the table. "If that child is his, the infidelity story becomes fragile." Isabella drank water without looking away. "Then we make her look dirtier. An abandoned pregnant woman always inspires sympathy unless we stain her first." Daniel understood. They needed to prepare another piece of evidence, perhaps a rumor about money, perhaps a manipulated medical result. In their world, truth was not a fact. It was property that could be bought, hidden, or destroyed. Isabella had the ring. She kept it in a velvet box inside her dressing room. Not because she wanted to wear it, but because possessing the object Lucy had lost gave her pleasure. Sometimes she looked at it and remembered the morning she and Daniel collected it from the pawn shop. She told George the jewelry had been emotionally stolen by an opportunist, and although the old man was suspicious, he agreed to sell it when Daniel's money and documents appeared on the counter. Isabella believed then that the story was closed. Without the ring, without the receipt in Lucy's hands, without Margaret conscious, and without Alexander willing to listen, the poor wife would become nothing more than an unpleasant rumor. But she had not counted on the pregnancy. She had not counted on the pale mark on Lucy's finger, or on the fact that some absences shout louder than a confession. That night, Alexander found Stephen Miller in a modest bar in Getafe, watching a game without really paying attention. The former security chief tried to leave when he recognized him, but Alexander did not threaten him. He showed him the ring receipt and said only one sentence. "I am trying to find out whether I destroyed an innocent woman." Stephen went still. Perhaps it was the word innocent, or perhaps he was tired of carrying something that did not belong to him. In his small apartment, hidden inside a toolbox, he had kept a copy of the hotel recording. "I was fired because I refused to erase everything without keeping a backup," he explained. His cousin came with a blonde woman. They wanted only the angles that made it look like something else. The complete video shows Daniel waiting in the street, and the photographer getting into his car afterward. Alexander watched the recording on Stephen's old computer. There was Lucy entering alone with a medical folder. There was Matthew arriving later. There was the German specialist greeting them in the lobby. And there, reflected in the entrance glass, was Daniel speaking on the phone while a man carrying a camera crossed the street. It was not a suspicion. It was an architecture of betrayal. Alexander felt something inside him break without a sound. For months, he had slept under the same roof as one of the men who destroyed his marriage, and had allowed Isabella to sit beside his mother, smiling with hands stained by elegant cruelty. Stephen gave him the copy with a warning. If they learn this exists, they will try to burn everything before it reaches a judge. When Alexander returned to the car, he found several messages from Isabella. She sweetly asked whether they should have dinner together, whether he was tired, whether he needed company. For the first time, every word sounded rehearsed, like an over-perfumed room meant to conceal the smell of smoke. He did not answer. He called Samuel and ordered him to secure copies of the video on 3 external servers, trace the documents used to collect the ring, and review every legal order issued against Matthew. Then he dialed Caroline Bennett. When she answered, Alexander spoke without arrogance. "I need to know whether Lucy is safe." Caroline remained silent for several seconds. "She is working, although she should not be, and if you are planning to appear with male drama, do not come." Alexander looked at the rain on the windshield. "I am not going to ask anything of her. I only want to make sure she is not alone if they decide to attack her." But Lucy was already being attacked in a quieter way. At the end of her shift, her supervisor handed her an administrative notice. Her contract would be reviewed over alleged irregularities in access to medical records. There was no evidence, only a vague accusation sufficient to frighten her. Lucy read the paper with cold hands. She understood immediately that someone had begun moving against her. Caroline tried to take it from her, but Lucy folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. "They are not going to stop," she whispered. "Then let someone help you," Caroline replied. Lucy shook her head and looked toward the room where a newborn cried behind the glass. "Alexander's help always arrives after the wound. I cannot build my child's safety on the regret of a man who still does not understand how much damage he caused." Hours later, Alexander received an enlarged image from the video in his encrypted email, clearly showing Daniel beside the photographer. In another folder, Samuel attached the document used to remove the ring from the pawn shop. The signature used as family authorization belonged neither to Alexander nor Margaret, but to Daniel Whitmore, with Isabella Reynolds listed as the witness to the acquisition. Alexander stared at the names until they stopped being family and became enemies. Then he opened a drawer, removed the copy of the divorce papers, and tore it into 4 slow pieces. Not because he believed Lucy would return to him, but because he understood the document had been born from a lie. He then wrote a message to his lawyer. "Suspend every proceeding." To Samuel, he wrote, "Tomorrow we will convene the board. But first I need to see my mother. If Margaret remembers anything, This will not merely be a family scandal. It will be a war. Lucy knew something bad was going to happen before she saw Isabella Reynolds cross the hospital entrance. She felt it in the way her supervisor avoided her eyes, in the sudden silence among the afternoon shift nurses, and in the anonymous message that appeared on her phone while she changed an elderly patient's IV. Women who steal surnames should not raise heirs. For several seconds, Lucy stared at the screen without breathing. Then she turned it off, slipped the phone into her pocket, and continued working, because she could not afford to collapse in front of patients who bore no responsibility for her tragedy. But the baby moved forcefully, as though it sensed the danger too, and she rested one hand on her belly, trying to give it a calm she no longer possessed. Isabella arrived at 7:20, dressed in white, an expensive coat draped over her shoulders, and a smile that did not belong in a hospital. She did not come alone. 2 men from a private law firm accompanied her, along with an assistant discreetly recording on a phone and the administrative supervisor who had signed the review of Lucy's contract. The maternity corridor filled with strange tension, as though a society scene had invaded a place where people prayed in silence. Isabella looked Lucy up and down, pausing at her belly with delicate contempt. "How moving," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. The expelled wife, pregnant, working nights in the hospital, owned by the family she tried to ruin. If it were not so vulgar, it would look like a brilliant strategy. Lucy did not answer. She held a folder against her chest and tried to pass. But one of the lawyers stepped in front of her with a document extended. Isabella moved closer, perfumed, flawless, cruel. "Do not worry. We did not come to hurt you. We came to offer you a way out before your situation becomes embarrassing for everyone. You sign here and acknowledge that the baby has no claimable connection to Alexander Whitmore. You waive any financial right and agree to leave Madrid in exchange for reasonable compensation. No one will investigate your conduct. No one will speak about Matthew Sullivan. No one will ask how a temporary aide accessed private files." Lucy felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, not because of herself, but because the word baby had been turned into a clause, a threat, and a price. Several nurses pretended to arrange trays, but all of them were listening. An orderly pressed his lips together. Caroline Bennett appeared at the far end of the corridor and stood still, measuring the distance between Lucy and danger. Isabella used the audience because she had always known that private humiliation merely wounded, but public humiliation chained a person. "Do not play the martyr, Lucy. Girls like you think a pregnancy can buy them a second chance in families like ours. But a family name cannot be begged for with tears, or conquered by sleeping in hotels." Lucy raised her head, and something changed in her face. It was not exactly anger. It was exhaustion transformed into dignity. "You can buy lawyers, silences, and magazine covers," she said quietly. "But you cannot buy my fear, because I spent all of it the night they threw me out in the rain." The corridor became completely still. Isabella had not expected resistance. She expected tears, excuses, a trembling signature, perhaps a desperate attempt to call Alexander. But Lucy held the document, looked at it for barely a second, and tore it in half in front of everyone. It was not theatrical. It was slow, clean, and final. "I am poor, Isabella, not stupid. My child will not be anyone's bargaining chip. And if one day he carries the Whitmore name, it will not be because you allowed it, but because the truth will force every one of you to lower your heads." The assistant stopped recording by instinct. Caroline smiled faintly. Isabella, however, lost control of her face for the first time. The elegant mask cracked, revealing an old fury. The fury of someone who had never imagined that a woman she considered inferior could challenge her without trembling. The response came as immediate revenge. The supervisor announced that Lucy was provisionally suspended, pending an internal investigation, and one of the lawyers added that the hospital would review possible unauthorized access to medical records. The accusation was false, but the effect was real. Lucy felt unable to breathe. She could not lose the job. Without those shifts, she could not pay the rent. She could not buy vitamins or attend checkups, or prepare a room for the baby who was only weeks from being born. Isabella leaned toward her with an almost intimate smile. "I offered you a dignified way out. Now you will learn that dignity does not pay for rooms, diapers, or lawyers? Lucy tried to answer, but a sharp pain tore through her abdomen and forced her to grip the counter. Caroline moved immediately, pushing everyone aside with a professional command that admitted no argument. "A chair now, and someone call obstetrics," Caroline ordered as she held Lucy by the shoulders. Lucy tried to say she was fine, but the words died in her mouth when another cramp doubled her over. Fear changed sides in the corridor. The same employees who had watched with curiosity now moved urgently, searching for a stretcher, clearing away papers and closing doors. Isabella stepped back, not from compassion, but calculation. A pregnant woman collapsing after a public threat could become a scandal difficult to disguise. Lucy struggled to breathe, her face covered in cold sweat, while a single thought pounded through her mind. Not now. "Please, do not make my child pay for these people's poison." Caroline took her hand and spoke into her ear with maternal firmness. "Look at me, Lucy. You and your baby are going to fight with me." Alexander received Caroline's call while he was in Margaret's private room. His mother had just awakened with more clarity than she had shown in weeks, although she still looked like a fallen queen among white sheets. Before the phone rang, Alexander had shown her the ring receipt without revealing everything, and Margaret had looked at him as though a locked door in her memory were beginning to open. "She was there," the woman whispered. "Lucy was holding my hand. I wanted to tell her not to call anyone, that Daniel would be angry about the accounts, but she did not obey me. Thank God she did not obey me." Alexander felt guilt tighten around his chest, but he had no time to respond. Caroline spoke rapidly. Lucy was having contractions, severe stress, and a possible threat of premature labor. Alexander ran from the room before Margaret could ask what had happened. When he reached maternity, he saw Isabella in the corridor and understood too much. She tried to approach him with rehearsed concern, but Alexander stopped her with a look that left her frozen. "What did you do to her?" he asked. Isabella opened her mouth in offense. "I only came to prevent a scandal." She became upset because she knows the truth is catching up with her. Alexander stepped toward her, and the corridor seemed to shrink. "Do not use that word in front of me again until you know what it means." Then he entered the room where Lucy lay connected to a monitor, while Caroline and an obstetrician checked the baby's heartbeat. Lucy saw him, and fear returned to her face, more painful than reproach. "No," she murmured. "Do not let him in if he has come for my child." Alexander stopped as though the words had struck the center of his soul. "I did not come to take anything from you," he said in a voice he barely recognized as his own. "I came because I should have been here much earlier." Lucy closed her eyes, too tired to hate him with strength. The monitor continued marking fast, fragile, living heartbeats. Alexander stayed beside the door without touching her, demanding explanations or claiming rights. For the first time, he did the one thing he should have done from the beginning. He remained without invading. Caroline watched him from the corner of her eye, still distrustful, but did not throw him out. Outside, Samuel arrived carrying a folder, his face tense. There was more news. Daniel had sent an urgent request to a private laboratory to prepare a negative paternity report using unverified samples. He had also tried to erase hotel records and block Margaret's file. The lie was no longer defending itself. It was attacking in desperation. Alexander stepped into the corridor with dangerous calm. Samuel handed him copies, internal emails, orders signed by Daniel, messages between lawyers, and documents showing Isabella pressuring the hospital to suspend Lucy. Every page was part of a machine designed to crush a pregnant woman before she could speak. "I want all of this duplicated, notarized, and sent to the Economic Crimes Prosecutor's Office, if anything happens to me," Alexander said. "And I want the laboratory to receive a legal warning. Any result without chain of custody will constitute medical fraud." Samuel nodded, but added in a lower voice, "Daniel emptied a secondary group account. He may try to leave the country tonight." Alexander looked toward the room where Lucy was fighting to stabilize, and then toward the corridor, where Isabella was still pretending indignation. "Have discreet security cover every entrance. No one approaches Lucy without Caroline's authorization." At the Whitmore mansion, Daniel was already losing patience. He paced his study, holding an untouched drink, while speaking with an airport contact. The original idea had been simple: discredit Lucy, force her to renounce everything, manufacture doubts about paternity, and push Alexander toward an alliance with Isabella before the old documents came to light. But Alexander had moved more quickly than expected. The hotel video was a mortal risk. The ring receipt was worse because it did not merely prove Lucy's sacrifice. It connected the money to Margaret's operation, and therefore to the account freeze Daniel had manipulated. If Margaret remembered everything, the entire board would collapse. Daniel called Isabella. "The time for elegance is over," he said. "I need you to keep Alexander occupied. I am leaving Madrid tonight." Isabella understood then that Daniel intended to abandon her with dirty hands. Her pride, more than her conscience, rebelled. "You will not leave me alone in this," she answered. Daniel gave a brief laugh. "Dear Isabella, you wanted to become Mrs. Whitmore. Learn something about powerful families. When the ship sinks, everyone saves their own surname." He ended the call. Isabella remained in the hospital corridor, surrounded by white lights, for the first time without a perfect plan. In the distance, she saw Alexander speaking with Samuel, saw Caroline's closed expression, and saw two discreet guards position themselves near maternity. The story was slipping from her hands. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She found a camera, called a friendly journalist, and leaked that Alexander Whitmore was being extorted by his pregnant estranged wife inside one of the group's hospitals. If she could not win in private, she would set the scene on fire in public. The story began spreading online before midnight. Unsigned headlines spoke of a pregnant aide, a multi-million-dollar divorce, possible blackmail, and a CEO trapped by a shameful relationship. In the observation room, Lucy did not see the posts, but she noticed phones vibrating and certain looks beginning to change again. Caroline ordered everyone not to show her anything. Alexander, however, read every line with a new coldness. In the past, those insinuations would have fed his anger toward Lucy. Now they showed him clearly how his enemies operated. Stain her before the truth had a chance to speak. Margaret saw a news update on television from her room. She demanded to be propped upright, clumsily pulled out her IV, and insisted that her son be called. When Alexander entered, he found his mother pale, furious, and more alive than she had been in months. "Bring a camera," Margaret said. Alexander thought he had misheard. "Mom, you need to rest." She looked at him with the old authority illness had failed to erase. "I rested for 6 months, while a woman who saved my life was treated like garbage by my own blood. I will not rest for another minute." Margaret asked her personal secretary, a loyal employee Daniel had pushed aside, to recover a letter she had dictated weeks after the operation, when she was still confused but remembered fragments. In that letter, Margaret thanked Lucy for authorizing the treatment and mentioned the ring she had sold. Daniel had hidden it, claiming it was the product of post-operative delirium. Now, in a trembling voice, Margaret repeated what she remembered before Alexander. Lucy, kneeling beside her bed, promising that Alexander should not know about the payment until the negotiation ended, because she did not want to add another burden to his shoulders. Alexander did not cry. He became so still that even Margaret was frightened. He had spent his life believing power meant acting without hesitation, but that night, he understood that his greatest cowardice had been acting too quickly when he should have listened. He approached his mother's bed and took her hand. "I am going to fix it," he said. Margaret weakly shook her head. "No, son. You do not repair a humiliation the way you correct a contract. First, you acknowledge it in front of everyone. Then, if she wants you to, you begin making amends." Those words were harder than any reproach. Alexander nodded. He then instructed Samuel to convene an emergency board meeting the next morning with legal advisors, corporate media, and members of the family present. If Isabella wanted a spectacle, she would have one, but not according to her script. Before dawn, Lucy stabilized. The premature labor stopped, although the obstetrician was clear. She needed absolute bed rest. Lucy listened with practical sadness, thinking about rent, her suspended contract, and food for the following week. Alexander, seated several yards away, heard everything and did not dare offer money. After so much damage, he understood that any gesture could sound like a purchase. When the doctors left, Lucy turned her head toward him. "Do not mistake this for a reconciliation," she said, exhausted but lucid. "Discovering some lies does not erase the ones you chose to believe." Alexander accepted the blow without defending himself. I know, she swallowed. And I do not want your family near my child. I know, he repeated. Then he added in a more broken voice, but tomorrow I am going to say publicly what I should have said that night, that I had no right to condemn you without listening. Lucy did not answer. Perhaps because she did not believe him. Perhaps because part of her was afraid to believe him. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion overcome her. Alexander remained until Caroline forced him to leave. In the corridor, Samuel waited with the latest update. Daniel had attempted to take a private flight from Torrejon using corporate documents, but internal security, alerted by suspicious financial movements, had blocked his access to the aircraft. He had not yet been arrested, but he was cornered. Isabella, meanwhile, denied any connection to the media leak, although the journalist who received the information had just confirmed contact from her personal assistant. Alexander remained silent. The net was closing, but he knew the fall of his enemies would not return Lucy's nights of fear, or the first kick from the baby he had never felt. At 10 in the morning, Whitmore Health's main boardroom was full. Board members, lawyers, relatives, communications advisors, and several selected journalists waited for an explanation of the previous night's rumors. Isabella arrived dressed in dark blue, pretending solemnity. Daniel appeared late, with a tense face, trying to maintain the composure of a man who still believed he could negotiate. Margaret entered in a wheelchair, accompanied by a nurse and Dr. Caroline Bennett, whose presence made several executives exchange uncomfortable looks. Alexander stood at the front without sitting. On the table were sealed folders, a drive containing the hotel video, the ring receipt, Margaret's letter, laboratory documents, and the blocking orders Daniel had signed. For the first time, he did not look like a CEO defending his company. He looked like a man prepared to set fire to his surname to pull an innocent woman from the ashes. For 6 months, Alexander began, looking first at the board and then at the cameras. I allowed a lie to destroy my wife. The room went still. Isabella turned pale. Daniel lowered his gaze to the folders and understood he was no longer facing suspicions. Alexander continued more firmly. I accused Lucy Carter of a betrayal she never committed. I expelled her from my home immediately after she saved my mother's life. I believed a manipulated photograph created by people seated in this very room. And last night, those same people attempted to force her to waive her child's rights through threats, defamation, and medical fraud. Margaret closed her eyes, as though every word hurt and healed at once. Isabella tried to stand, but Alexander pressed a control, and the screen displayed the full hotel video. At last, truth stopped being a plea and became evidence. The boardroom screen showed the complete hotel recording, without music, headlines, or the comfort of rumors. Lucy appeared entering alone, with a medical folder against her chest. Matthew Sullivan arrived minutes later. The German specialist greeted them in the lobby, and on the other side of the glass, Daniel Whitmore stood speaking on the phone beside the photographer, who later climbed into his car. No one moved. The board members' silence was no longer caution, but fear. Isabella tried to keep her chin raised, but the color had drained from her face. Daniel, meanwhile, watched the exit like an animal calculating the distance to the only open door. Alexander let the recording end before speaking because, for the first time in 6 months, he did not want to impose a version. He wanted the truth to walk by itself in front of everyone. That photograph was cropped, manipulated, and sent to my phone to make me believe my wife was betraying me, Alexander said, holding the control with a calm more frightening than any shout. But that night, Lucy Carter was not with a lover. She was collecting medical reports to save Margaret Whitmore, my mother, while some of you froze accounts, hid documents, and prepared her destruction. Margaret, seated in the wheelchair, raised a trembling hand. Her voice came out weak, but every word crossed the room with the authority of a sentence. Lucy paid for my urgent medication with her wedding ring. I would be dead if she had followed the protocols others used to protect their interests. The woman you called an opportunist was the only person who behaved like family. Alexander placed the enlarged, certified pawnshop receipt on the table beside the record where George had written that Lucy cried when she surrendered the piece. He then displayed the document used to remove the ring, signed by Daniel and endorsed by Isabella as witness. Isabella's breathing became uneven, She could no longer present herself as a concerned friend or a patient fiancé. Her name was on the paper, proving that she had bought the evidence of Lucy's sacrifice in order to hide it. A corporate journalist invited to control reputational damage lowered his camera with trembling hands. This was not a public relations crisis. It was the moral collapse of a family that had allowed a pregnant woman to be humiliated for saving an elderly woman. Daniel struck the table. All of this is a sentimental interpretation. It proves no fraud and no crime. Samuel Brooks opened another folder and projected internal emails, financial blocking orders, messages to the private laboratory, and requests to manufacture a paternity report without chain of custody. The cold, clean, bureaucratic language was more repulsive than any insult. There were the instructions to discredit Lucy, suspend her contract, leak rumors of extortion, and prepare a negative result using unverified samples. Alexander did not look at Daniel with hatred, but with hard sorrow. You wanted my position, my shares, and my name. To obtain them, you used my mother's illness, Isabella's ambition, and my worst flaw, my pride. Daniel tried to laugh, but the sound died before it was born. 2 officers from the Economic Crimes Unit, discreetly summoned by the outside legal team, entered through the side door. Then everyone understood that the meeting was not only a public confession, it was a surrender. Isabella finally stood, desperate to recover some form of control. Alexander, you threw her out too. You called her a traitor too. You cannot stand beside the victim now, as though you did not enjoy believing she was guilty. The room turned toward him, waiting for a defense, but Alexander offered none. He lowered his gaze for an instant and accepted the blow, because it was true. Yes, he answered. I destroyed her when I should have protected her. I chose to believe a lie because it was easier than confronting my insecurities and the prejudices inside my own home. That is why I am not here today to appear innocent. I am here to say in front of everyone that Lucy Carter was innocent, even when I treated her as guilty. Margaret closed her eyes in pain. Isabella understood that her final weapon had become useless because Alexander was no longer running from his guilt. Daniel tried to leave, but the officers stopped him before he reached the door. The scene did not possess the drama he believed he deserved. There were no heroic speeches or final threats, only the dry click of handcuffs closing around wrists, accustomed to signing orders against other people. Isabella stepped back, afraid they would come for her as well. Whitmore Health's outside counsel announced that civil and criminal proceedings would begin for document manipulation, defamation, medical fraud, coercion, and misuse of corporate information. The Reynolds family, alerted by the scandal, immediately issued a statement distancing themselves from Isabella and suspended her representation in every shared company. In front of cameras and board members, the woman who had called Lucy vulgar discovered that a surname also abandons its own when shame threatens investments. Her elegance was suddenly left without an army. While the boardroom burned with consequences, Lucy remained on bed rest inside Santa Aurelia Hospital, unaware of the exact details of her enemy's fall. Caroline had forbidden her from looking at her phone, but no prohibition could stop the murmurs in the corridor. First she heard that Margaret had spoken, then that Daniel had been arrested, and afterward that Isabella had left escorted by her own lawyers, pale and refusing questions. Lucy did not feel joy. She felt tired. When truth arrives late, it does not enter like a celebration. It enters like a harsh light that also reveals everything broken in the darkness. She rested a hand on her belly and thought about the baby, the nights on buses, the ring she had sold, and the divorce papers she never signed. She had survived, yes, but surviving was not the same as healing. Alexander arrived at the hospital at dusk, without visible bodyguards, without a lawyer, and without the coat of an invincible businessman. He remained in the doorway until Caroline decided he could enter, although she warned him with the gaze of a woman capable of throwing him out by force if he took one wrong step. Lucy sat propped against pillows, paler than usual, her hair tied back and her eyes too calm. Alexander did not approach the bed. He placed a folder on the side table, far from her hands, like an offering demanding no answer. Copies of everything are there, he said. The video, the receipt, Daniel's documents, my mother's statement, and the suspension of the divorce proceedings. You do not have to read them now. You do not have to speak to me. I only wanted you to have them before any judge, journalist, or Whitmore. Lucy stared at the folder for a long time. For 6 months. The only thing I wanted was for you to believe me without needing a folder, she finally said. Alexander received the sentence as he should have, without defending himself. I know. She gave a small, humorless laugh. No, Alexander. You do not know. You lost a wife because of a lie. I lost a home, stable work, my ring, my health, and the peace of my pregnancy, because the man I loved looked at me as though I were garbage. He lowered his head. Every word was fair, and that was precisely why it hurt more. I did not come to ask you to return, he replied. That would be another form of selfishness. I came to ask permission to repair whatever I can, even if you never forgive me. And I came to acknowledge that this child will be protected first by your will, not by my surname. Lucy placed a hand on her belly when the baby moved. For an instant, both of them looked at the same place, without touching. It was a strange, painful intimacy, made of what might have been and what could still be built if no one tried to force it. You will not use lawyers against me, she said. You will never decide where I live, where I work, or how I raise my child. No. You will not allow your family to look at him as property. If anyone tries, they will have to face me. Lucy studied him then, looking for arrogance, haste, or an empty promise. She found guilt, fear, and something resembling humility. It was not enough. Perhaps it would not be enough for years. But it was the first time Alexander Whitmore seemed to understand that love was not claiming rights over a wound, but learning to remain beside it, without demanding that it close quickly. Margaret asked to see Lucy 2 days later. The visit was brief, because both women were weak, but neither needed grand speeches. The matriarch entered in a wheelchair, with a dark shawl over her shoulders and a small box in her lap. Alexander waited outside. Margaret approached the bed and, for the first time since they had met, took Lucy's hand with true respect. I did not defend you when my silence was worth more than all my money, she said. I cannot change that. But I can tell you that I am ashamed I allowed this family to confuse class with cruelty. Lucy did not cry until Margaret opened the box and revealed the wedding ring. It had been recovered from Isabella's dressing room during the legal search, kept as a miserable trophy. It is yours, Margaret whispered, not because you are my son's wife, but because you paid for it with love, when no one else had the courage. Lucy did not put the ring on immediately. She held it between her fingers, the way one holds something that burns and comforts at the same time. She remembered the pawn shop, the rain, the shame of surrendering a promise to buy medicine, and the night Alexander saw her bare hand and chose to condemn her. The ring no longer meant the same thing. It had once symbolized belonging to a love. Now it was proof of a survival no one could take from her. I do not know whether I can wear it again, she confessed. Margaret nodded. Then do not wear it until it means something you have chosen for yourself. Those words, coming from a woman who had spent years living in obedience to the Whitmore name, made Lucy cry in silence. Margaret cried too, but without asking for absolution. Sometimes repair begins when no one dares demand forgiveness. The following weeks were not a perfect ending, because life rarely delivers justice with soft music. Daniel faced charges and lost his holdings in the group. Isabella disappeared from Madrid for a time, pursued by headlines she could no longer control. Whitmore Health had to answer for internal irregularities, and Alexander publicly accepted responsibility at a press conference where he spoke Lucy's name without hiding her, embellishing her, or using her as an instrument of redemption. He said that a company devoted to caring for lives had allowed a chain of abuse against a vulnerable woman within its own structure. Many called it strategy. Others called it a downfall. Lucy cared little. She was learning something more difficult than endurance: how to rest without feeling guilty, accept help without feeling purchased, and look toward the future without allowing fear to decide for her. Alexander rented a simple apartment near the hospital, not for Lucy, but for himself. He sold part of his personal property to create an independent fund in the baby's name, legally administered by Lucy, until the child reached adulthood, with no marital conditions or demands that they live together. When Caroline reviewed the documents, She raised an eyebrow and said that at last a rich man had discovered the difference between helping and controlling. Alexander smiled faintly, accepting the irony like bitter medicine. He visited Lucy only when she allowed it. He brought food and left it at reception when she did not want to see him, and attended prenatal classes from the last row, learning to breathe through pains that were not yet his. He did not ask to touch her belly until one quiet afternoon, when Lucy took his hand and placed it there without speaking. The baby was born on a spring morning, when Madrid smelled of new rain and the hospital lights seemed less cruel. It was a long, difficult labor, filled with broken breaths, clenched hands, and contained fear. Alexander was present because Lucy permitted it, but he stayed where she instructed him, holding water, counting seconds, and obeying Caroline as though that room were the only board meeting that had ever truly mattered. When the child's cry filled the room, Alexander covered his mouth with one hand and wept without shame. Exhausted, Lucy received the baby against her chest and closed her eyes with a peace no one in the Whitmore family had ever given her. Caroline announced that he was a strong boy. Margaret, waiting outside, prayed for the first time in years without asking for power or prestige, only for the opportunity to do something right before she was gone. They named him Nicholas, not after any Whitmore ancestor, but after Caroline's father, a rural doctor who had taught his daughter that caring for someone meant believing them before judging them. The decision surprised everyone and offended several distant relatives, but Lucy did not ask permission. Alexander did not question it either. When they signed the registry, he looked at the space for the surname with an emotion difficult to contain. Nicholas would carry both names, but their order would be the one Lucy chose, Carter Whitmore. Alexander accepted without a trace of protest. Some considered it a humiliation. To him, it was the first just decision in a story where too many decisions had been made by men, afraid of losing authority. Lucy watched his reaction and remained silent. But that night, while Nicholas slept, she allowed Alexander to hold him for the first time without monitoring every movement. Months later, Lucy returned to Santa Aurelia Hospital, not as an exploited shift worker, but as the coordinator of a support program for vulnerable mothers, financed by an independent foundation she directed herself. She refused to include the Whitmore name in the project's title. She wanted no woman to feel that she had to belong to a powerful family in order to deserve care. Alexander attended the opening from the last row with Nicholas asleep in his arms and Margaret beside him. When Lucy stepped onto the small stage, she did not speak about revenge. She spoke about women who work through pain, about silences that appear protective but become prisons, and about children who should not be born into wars of pride. At the end, she looked at Alexander for barely a second. It was not a promise of reconciliation. It was something more honest, the recognition that some paths can begin again, without erasing the stones that broke them. One afternoon after returning home, Lucy opened the box where she kept the ring. Nicholas slept in his crib, and Alexander waited in the kitchen, awkwardly preparing a bottle, while Margaret argued with Caroline on the phone about broth recipes. Lucy removed the jewelry and studied it in the soft window light. She no longer saw the hotel night or the pawn shop counter. She saw a woman who had lost almost everything and had still protected a life. She placed the ring on a fine chain and wore it around her neck, close to her heart, not on her finger. When Alexander saw it, he did not behave like the owner of a second chance. He merely lowered his eyes in respect. Lucy approached Nicholas, touched the chain, and understood that she did not wear it because she had forgotten, but because she could finally remember without kneeling before the pain. Lucy Carter's story did not end with a divorce signature or another wedding staged to reassure other people. It ended, or perhaps began, with a woman deciding that her dignity was worth more than any surname, that love without trust can wound as deeply as hatred, and that forgiveness, when it comes, must never be demanded as a reward for regret. Alexander learned that one does not protect a person after destroying her, but before the world forces her to prove her innocence. Margaret learned that a family is measured not by blood, but by who remains when saving someone else costs something sacred. And Nicholas grew up surrounded by a simple truth stronger than every secret. A lie can buy photographs, lawyers, and silence, but it can never erase the trail of a mother who sold her ring to save a life.